So welcome to all for this conference organized by Irish Heritage Quebec for September 9th, 2024. The Board of Directors is very happy to see you all for the start of our fall season of activities. Tonight's conference is entitled Battlegrounds of Identity, How War Posters Shaped Nationalism in Ireland and French Canada, 1914-1918, and our speaker is Aimée Dion. Aimée is a doctoral candidate in history at Université Laval. She's the author of Affiches de guerre, guerre d'Affiches, published by Les Presses de l'Université Laval in 2024. Aimée is also a recipient of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council doctoral grant. Aimée's research explores Great War propaganda in French Canada and in Ireland from 1914 to 1918, with a focus on visual culture. Aimée examines how images influenced war cultures and political discourse, using a comparative approach to understand how representations of violence and nationalism shaped collective identity. So without further ado, I'm pleased to invite Aimée Dion to speak to the members and friends of Irish Heritage Quebec.
Well, I'd like to start off by thanking Irish Heritage Quebec for the invitation to speak today. I always enjoy occasions to present my research, so thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to show you guys what I'm working on. Is the volume okay? Am I speaking? Great. Okay, so I'm going to start out by taking everyone back into the summer of 1914, right at the start of World War I. So the Great War was a pivotal moment for French Canadians and for the Irish, because as the war broke out, England had to call upon her empire for support. This led to significant challenges and transformations within French Canada and Ireland, as both communities had already been grappling with significant crises. This was a period that was marked with important social strife due to the Regulation 17 in Canada, which banned the French language education in Ontario. So this sparked important nationalist mobilization in both Quebec and Ontario from 1912 onwards, which led to an increase in the number of French Canadian nationalist associations and activity. Also in 1912, the Home Rule Bill was first introduced in Ireland, which caused important debates over Ireland's political autonomy and future within the UK. So opposing Irish nationalists to Unionists, the prospect of devolution eventually led Ireland to the brink of civil war during the summer of 1914. So during the years leading up to the war, there was important nationalist mobilization on both sides of the Atlantic within these two minority communities. And this brought about significant ethno-linguistic tensions between majorities and minorities. Today I'm going to explore the dynamics of nationalism and war mobilization as told through World War I propaganda posters. As vehicles of national identity, these posters reflect the evolving nationalist identities in both French Canada and Ireland between 1914 and 1918. So we can see how societies represented themselves as nations within an empire at war during this time. So how did propaganda efforts play on these communities' sense of identity? And how alike were French Canada and Ireland's war experiences? These are the questions I'm going to be answering today. First, I'm going to take a look at the war cultures produced during the first half of the war to show you that both French Canadian and Irish war posters played on these communities' sense of cultural uniqueness. So they were appealing to to the differences that set these minority communities apart from the rest of Canada and the rest of the UK. And then I'm going to show you that during the second half of the war, their nationalist paths diverged. And as Ireland embarked on nationalist radicalization that eventually led to the War of Independence, in Canada, tensions between the French, Canadian, and Anglophone communities eventually died down. And nationalism became more and more Republican and eventually radical in Ireland, whereas French-Canadian nationalism was played down in the war posters in a bid to foster emerging binational and bilingual Canadian identity during the war. So the cultural differences between the French Canadian and English Canadian communities were downplayed from 1916 onwards, which reflected the changing relationship of French Canadians with the Anglo-Protestant majority of the rest of the Dominion. In Ireland, the sense of cultural otherness that the nationalist community had eventually led to the affirmation of political otherness, so as guaranteed by the Irish Republic. So I'm going to show you how posters reflect the construction of new national identities that emerged during the war, leading to the reaffirmation of the Canadian Confederation and to eventually Irish independence. So starting with the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, Canada and Ireland were both aligned with the British Empire, and they found themselves automatically at war. Popular belief thought that it would be a very short conflict with soldiers returning home by Christmas. However, this was not the case. And as the war dragged on, the need to boost recruitment became more and more clear as all nations sunk into total war. So war posters became a tool that was necessary in order to go and recruit more volunteers to join the armed forces. And war posters were especially produced in 1915. Posters were initially created by local and private organizations and also by small military units. So it was a very grassroots movement for poster production at the beginning of the war. They served as visual reminders urging people to lend their men, money, and morale to the war's effort. They served both to help people imagine what the war looked like overseas, and they also provided reasons to justify these communities' involvement in the war. And although the war's causes were very complicated, involving political alliances, imperial ambitions, and an arms race, for example, all these causes were largely absent from posters, which instead based their war discourse on nationalism. So World War I is a really fascinating moment in the history of these two communities because both nations had been grappling with very important internal crises since 1912 related to the linguistic and political rights of Francophone and Irish minorities. So the war's onset posed a significant challenge, and in a bid to avert rebellion during this time of political turmoil, propaganda efforts tried to capitalize on French Canadian and Irish nationalism in order to promote popular participation in the war. So for the first time, people's relationship to their nation became more important than ever. Calls to nationalism served to connect individuals to the collective war effort, and in a total war such as this one, everyone was called upon to contribute. Authorities tried to play on Irish and French Canadian nationalism to mobilize the masses. Voluntary recruitment was the main theme that was promoted, which served as a way to sell the war's legitimacy. And as these communities were already very involved in political debates at the time, appealing to their sense of nationalism provided an opportunity to reconcile political differences within the population. Taking up arms served as a way of both pacifying internal differences between the population, but also by proving that these minority communities were indeed nations. And through posters, the war was reframed as an opportunity to fight for one's nation. And I don't need to remind you that the British Crown, didn't always enjoy widespread popularity within these two communities. And that's why posters tried to persuade and not coerce these communities into wanting to fight for the British Empire, and without reigniting ethnic conflicts within the communities. So the goal was to kind of band everyone together behind the war effort and to overcome the political division within Canada and Ireland. Poster makers had to navigate a really important problem. They needed to draw upon nationalism to mobilize these communities while also avoiding further reigniting political demands. So the posters provide a lens through which we can examine the complexities of national identity during the early 20th century, and we can see the different contradictions in having to mobilize for an empire with which they had a difficult history. So how did French Canadian and Irish societies negotiate having to participate in the Great War while also navigating a difficult relationship with the British Empire? So during the first half of the war, given the mixed feelings about the relationship to the empire, posters sought to channel French Canadian and Irish nationalism in a way that aligned with the empire's needs. They needed messages that resonated with the people by linking their distinct cultural heritage to the war's effort. They presented recruitment as a natural extension of French, Canadian, and Irish identity by playing on cultural otherness, the sense of having a distinct cultural identity, to justify participating in the war. They aimed to make military enlistment seem like a natural extension of patriotic nationalist duty by using historical and cultural symbols to garner support. So during the early years of the war, posters emphasized cultural markers like Catholic faith, popular memory, and minority culture to foster nationalist mobilization. Between 1914 and 1915, their distinct cultural heritage was leveraged by propaganda initiatives. Drawing from French-Canadian nationalism and moderate Irish nationalism, war posters artfully involved cultural distinctiveness, so what would set them apart from the rest of the British Empire, while also mitigating the overtly political undertones of these nationalist movements that demanded political and linguistic rights. So, considered a crucial part of French-Canadian and Irish identity, Catholic faith was shown under threat in the posters. Posters would use apocalyptic symbols, such as we can see here with the burning churches, to showcase the threat to national survival. Enrollment was therefore imperative to ensure the nation's survival. They cast the Germans as Huns that have desecrated the cathedrals of France and Belgium, therefore framing the war as a crusade to defend Christian values. Not only do these posters depict the war as a crusade, they also show a cultural war. They show the existential threats to the nation's culture upon which their claims to nationhood were staked. This is shown in the posters on the left and on the right, where the nationalist icons, the French Marianne and St. Patrick, implore the spectator to join the ranks and enlist in order to protect the nation. They show the German bombing of the Reims Cathedral, providing shocking images to highlight German barbarity. And the destruction of the cathedral, which brought about no military gain at the time, was interpreted as Germany's declaration of war against Christian civilization. The cathedral therefore symbolizes the minority nation that's under attack, and not without recalling English efforts of assimilation from the past and also the not so recent past. The church was understood as a gathering place that defined the nation and forged collective identity. So the cathedral here symbolizes the individuals belonging to the nation and minority cultures that defined themselves in relationship to Catholicism. By presenting the war as a threat to the survival of the Catholic religion, it was the nation's very identity that was shown as being under threat, and this justified having to go to war in Europe. So they transformed the war for the empire into a holy war, the defense of the Christian religion, and posters framed enlistment as a moral duty to the nation. Here, it's Ireland and French Canada's distinct cultural identity that's shown under fire. And while there were many Protestants in Ireland, posters mainly appealed to the Catholics because as Unionists were already generally loyal to the crown and didn't need further arguments to go. So that's why we showed mainly the Catholic religion and references. Posters also used cultural nationalism to overcome the potential aversion to having to fight for the crown. And of course, this is quite ironic, given that the posters called upon the very Catholic identity that the crown had tried to assimilate throughout the 19th century in order to garner support for the crown's war. And Catholic faith served here as the prism through which they presented the war by trying to play on sectarian identity to justify fighting for the crown. For French Canadians who were living in the wake of Regulation 17, this was probably seen as a powerful motivator to join the ranks and fight, as French Canadian identity was already under fire. So both in Canada and Ireland, Catholic faith and also their French and Gaelic heritage served as barriers against assimilation within a predominantly Anglo-Protestant community. Cultural nationalism was therefore a way of demonstrating national vitality and enrolling to and joining arms. This was a way of defending that cultural identity. Posters also would play on French Canadian and Irish historical myths by declaring the nation as one that had a distinct past that was different than that of the rest of Canada and the rest of the UK. Posters played on popular memory and historical myths to present the Great War in terms that were familiar to these populations. They played on particular political culture in order to garner support for the war. Therefore, they associated contemporary soldiers with those from the past. And these posters tried to legitimize the current conflict by appealing to nostalgia for the past, although certain historical figures were omitted to avoid stirring up political tensions. They drew parallels also between contemporary battles that were fought during World War I and the historic struggles that defined the 19th century, in order to frame the war as a continuation of a noble, heroic tradition. By highlighting the role of martial heroes and mythical battles, posters exemplified the notion of what we call a martial race, whereas past rebellions were often seen as expressions of these communities' love of war. Inserting this tendency to combat into the nation's very identity. So in order to kind of reconcile the contradictions of having to defend an empire that had historically marginalized French Canadian and Irish communities, we evoke a past that we actually depoliticize, and using cultural nationalism by referencing a mythical past, but by depoliticizing this very past. The Great War, therefore, was inserted into some form of a national narrative and using popular memory as a way to justify fighting for the crown. On the right, the poster references the past nationalist struggles through the slogan, Éireann go bragh. This nationalist rallying cry from the 1798 Irish Rebellion, meaning Ireland forever, was redirected towards fighting for Britain. Here, the myth of the fighting Irish, the symbol of rebellion against the British, was reused in order to mobilize the nation to fight against Germany. And what we can see here is how Irish nationalism, which was formally directed against Britain, was leveraged to justify fighting for Germany under British flags. But this referencing of the past completely overshadowed the political causes for which the fighting originated. The slogan here is used to evoke the perceived innate martial qualities of the Irish, asking them to channel Ireland's old fighting spirit into the Empire's war. The real Irish spirit, shown here, is the love of fighting, of course, because we wouldn't want to spoil a good fight for want of men to win it. The love of war and the rebellious spirit of the Irish is seemingly what would define Ireland's difficult past with Britain, which completely overshadowed the political struggle against colonialism. So this kind of stereotype would take attention away from the political causes for which past violence was a tool, instead focusing on violence as a marker of Irish identity. So the posters redirected Irish nationalist symbols towards the Empire's war, while transforming Republican memory into a tool for moderate nationalism that fit into the Empire's war effort. By removing references to republicanism, it's the bravery, love of combat, and prowess in battle that form the core of these nations' supposed martial spirit. This is to overcome resentment towards Great Britain by downplaying and by depoliticizing past rebellions. Martial memory no longer refers to the political claims of these struggles, but rather to the perceived moral and physical qualities of the people that transcend time. So here in these posters, we can see the creation of specifically French Canadian and Irish war cultures, where emphasis on French Canadian and Irish nationality considered past struggles as expressions of the nation's martial qualities, and these qualities needed to be channeled towards the Great War. So by using the mobilizing power of nationalism and memory, we also avoid tension arising from past defeats, notably the nationalist rebellions of 1798 and 1837-38 in Canada. This selective memory is also used in French-Canadian posters to depoliticize the past in order to overcome past conflicts with Britain that could hinder mobilization. The poster on the left proclaims « N'oubliez pas, Canadiens français, que vous êtes descendants des compagnons de Dollard, des soldats de Montcalm et de Lévis, les fils des vainqueurs de Châteauguay et les frères des héros de Saint-Julien et de Festubert. » So we're linking the past battles to those that were taking place at the moment, contemporary battles in Europe, but we also have to pay attention to the terms. Descendants, sons, brothers, affirms the idea that all members of the nation possess common physical and moral attributes that are passed down from generation to generation. The phrase, "you are descendants of," lists the military achievements of the people, and participation in the Great War thus becomes part of this long heroic history. However, it's notable that only the Battle of Châteauguay is accompanied by the term victors. Historical defeats, therefore, were reframed as part of this grand heroic history, and Montcalm's important loss against the English is completely forgotten. Past grievances are minimized to portray instead a courageous and martial people. By overlooking the failures of Dollard and Montcalm on the battlefield, the myth transforms these setbacks into a glorious military past that justifies the enlistment of French Canadians for the Empire. And while posters often reference Dollard des Ormeaux, Montcalm, Salaberry, heroic military ancestors, the patriotes are absent from this pantheon, although they occupied a very important place in popular memory. So this omission shows us that invoking the patriote would have probably provoked political claims that would have impaired the war's mobilization. So they're excluded from this national narrative presented by the posters. Therefore, posters evoked cultural nationalism while overshadowing its political undertones in order to resolve potential contradictions related to having to fight for the British Empire. They highlight the French, Canadian, and Irish martial qualities while urging the men to enlist and fulfill their military destiny that was given to them by their ancestors generations ago. So this selective memory employs a form of a non-threatening form of nationalism that tried to avoid igniting political passions or anti-imperial sentiments. Posters reduced French, Canadian, and Irish nationalism to their cultural identity while neglecting the political claims that marked the past and the present. Posters also called upon these communities' particular interests in foreign policy and on the global stage. In French-Canadian posters, nationalism meant calling upon the nation's unbroken cultural ties with France. So posters would play on the nation's French roots while leveraging the relationship to France in order to justify waging the war. No longer in Britain or in Canada's name, the war here was fought for France. And posters played on the French traditions, qui ont fait la gloire et l'orgueil de notre race, in order to justify recruitment. The French flags here symbolize this lingering affection for France, serving as reminders to join arms in solidarity with the old motherland. Alors, pour aider à la victoire du coq gaulois sur l'aigle prussien, so to help France win over Germany, this essentially was the argument presented to the French-Canadian population. Solidarity with France was therefore imperative and justified enrollment in order to help out their former mother country. And one poster even declares, "Le Prussien est encore sur le sol de France, et la France est notre ancienne mère patrie." So posters completely just used this lingering relationship as the main reason for having to go to war. Posters also featured French soldiers termed as the poilus, and the poilu here shown on the yellow poster is in fact a French-Canadian soldier, thus defining Francophones in Canada as essentially French. The poster proclaims that the poilus are coming, but by referencing French Canadians, this actually shows the French Canadian soldiers akin to their French from France counterparts, emphasizing their shared heritage. Posters therefore express the special relationship that defines this community with France, showing the unbroken emotional bonds to their old mother country, despite actually serving to bolster recruitment for England. And in order to overcome the potential contradictions of fighting for France, which was Britain's historic enemy, right? Posters had to find a way to link the defense of France to the defense of the British Empire. And to address this issue, they called upon French Canadians to defend both of their motherlands, calling for support of this historic Franco-British alliance. By showing the French flag alongside the Union Jack, this aimed to foster unity amongst all of Canada by linking both French Canadians and English Canadians behind this historic alliance, and by showing their shared cause, thus overcoming past conflicts. And while French Canadian posters rationalized fighting for England as a way of displaying solidarity with France, Irish posters rationalized fighting for the Empire as a way to achieve home rule. So fighting in the Great War was seen as a way to obtain the Irish Parliament, supposedly ending a century-long struggle for political autonomy within the United Kingdom. Under John Redmond's party, who we can see on the poster on the left, home rule did eventually get adopted in 1914, but it was quickly suspended once the Great War broke out. And participating in the war was therefore seen as a way to finish the conflict and to get home rule faster. Enlisting therefore meant fighting for Ireland, and the promise of home rule served as a powerful incentive for many Irishmen, as about 200,000 of them did end up volunteering to serve during the time of the war. The poster in the center includes an Irish flag, the green one with the harp, among other Allied flags. And we can notice that the Irish flag is separated from the British Union Jack, which is interesting, as this probably symbolizes Irish political autonomy obtained through participating in the war. Ireland appears as a full-fledged belligerent with her own place among the Allies. And on the right, we can see an image of Ireland at war featuring Erin, the allegory of Ireland. The poster connects Irish national symbols to the war effort. By merging Gaelic cultural traits with the military universe, the poster uses an Irish harp, a soldier sounding the bugle, and an allegory of Erin to align Irish nationalism with the war effort. Therefore, navigating French Canada and Ireland's complex relationships with the Crown, propaganda efforts tried to appeal to national pride and highlighted their unique contributions to the war. This celebration of cultural identity in the posters eventually did prove hazardous to mobilization, as the war's difficulties drove calls to nationalist radicalization, culminating in conscription crises in both Quebec and Ireland. By 1916, references to cultural distinctiveness gave way to images emphasizing Canada and Ireland's political uniqueness in relation to the Empire. Both societies lived through important crises that strained their connection to the British Crown. Posters from 1916 to 1918 highlighted the emergence of new nationalist identities influenced by the demands of war. Canadian posters would showcase the nation as an autonomous belligerent state that sought to defend its own national interests throughout the war, and this dissociation from the Empire's interests and from France's interests also led to a decline in references to French-Canadian nationalism. Meanwhile, in Ireland, posters marked the triumph of Republican nationalism, while rejecting Irish participation in what came to be seen as England's war, heralding in the Irish War of Independence. From 1916 onwards, these two communities' paths would diverge, and although both Canadian and Irish posters sought to renegotiate their political ties to the Empire, the poster production was completely different. Canada and Ireland were swept by waves of dissent regarding conscription, and posters also served as agents of war memory, with the conflict acting as a springboard for autonomous and Republican national narratives. And although the Canadian territory was never threatened throughout the war, its national unity was. And this was a result of two factors mainly. First, the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916 brought about staggering losses, resulting in the deaths of 24,000 Canadians on a single day. These numbers fueled criticism of Canada's involvement in the war, with many, especially the French Canadians, starting to question if the sacrifices were worth the losses. And this growing disillusionment severely impacted recruitment, as recruits failed to keep up with the mounting casualties. This led to calls for conscription, which fractured public opinion. Announced by Prime Minister Robert Borden on January 1st, 1917, and established in 1918, conscription sparked important nationalist mobilization that left a lasting mark on French-Canadian memory. Conscription eventually led to the 1918 Easter riots in Quebec City that further deepened the rift between English and French Canadians and furthering unresolved conflicts over linguistic rights. And in order to diffuse this explosive situation, Canadian propaganda agencies would try to redefine the war's narrative. By 1916, references to French-Canadian nationalism started to plummet, and they got replaced by appeals to Canadian nationalism, which emphasized Canada's political autonomy within the empire. And this effort to pacify social tensions is evident in the propaganda, thus redefining French Canada's identity to quell dissent during a time of crisis. During the conscription crisis, French Canadians were faced with accusations of not pulling their weight, which further divided Canadian unity. And this need to resolve these conflicts convinced authorities to centralize propaganda production under the new War Poster Office in 1916. From 1916 onwards, most posters were produced by this federal agency, which was tasked with making posters in both languages. Posters would therefore use the same pictures with the same slogans that were translated into both languages. And in a bid to unify Canadian population, eventually the references to French-Canadian images and French-Canadian culture discourse would completely disappear from the posters. By standardizing mobilization messages, references to French-Canadian nationalism were absorbed into this new Canadian nationality. That would emphasize the shared traits between Anglophone and Francophone communities, instead of insisting on what set them apart. So these would seek to avoid further pitting Francophone and Anglo communities against each other. Instead of insisting on what made French Canadians unique, they insisted on what brought them together within this binational and bilingual identity. The posters are therefore considered French-Canadian by their language, but they bear no markers of French-Canadian nationalism or references to distinct cultural heritage, which had defined propaganda efforts during the first half of the war. The posters tried to serve as a social glue in times of crisis, serving to unite the two solitudes and reintegrate French Canadians into the Confederation. Therefore, poster production needed to control the discourse surrounding the war and conscription. This involved promoting a new bicultural and bilingual Canadian nation. And from now on, posters would target both French and English communities, and they built the image of, here we can see, the true Canadian, which was also un véritable Canadien. They would produce the same images and slogans in both languages, while trying to foster unity within a divided country. They also gave themselves images to support this new form of nationalism. As we can see, the maple leaf and the beaver would serve as icons of this new Canadian identity, while pushing forward an inclusive and unified nationality. Of course, this would completely exclude Indigenous populations from the narrative. They were not included in what was considered the Canadian identity, with the two founding populations coming together. The third one was completely excluded. And gone are references to France, Catholicism, to French-Canadian heroes from the past. Posters instead look towards building a new future with the Confederation, one that all communities could find their place in. This reframing of the country's identity also led to the reframing of the war's narrative. Posters therefore revised the reasons for Canada's involvement in the war. Gone are references to the British Empire, gone are references to France. Instead, posters would present a war that was fought to further Canada's own interests. They emphasized Canada's genuine economic and military stakes in the war. So this Canadianization of the war showed Canada taking on new responsibilities in foreign policy and military management. The posters reference nos soldats et nos alliés, using our to talk about supporting Canada's own soldiers abroad, supporting Canada's own allies in the war. And this showed Canada emerging as its own player in the war, one that had to advance its own interests. We're no longer talking about mobilizing to support France or the British Empire, but Canadians had to rally around their own country, and Canada's very future was shown at stake. Posters similarly highlighted Canada's economic interests, asking people to contribute to the war in order to maintain Canada's prosperity, citing the need to secure Canadian business in foreign markets, for example. The poster on the right shows shipments that are really identified on the picture as Canada steel, Canada cheese, Canada flour, Canada boots and shoes, Canada fruit, and Canada butter being loaded onto a boat for shipment abroad. And with their economic interests at stake, Canadians needed to mobilize for the country's well-being, which asserted Canada's relative political autonomy within the British Empire. Thus, Canadian nationalism also became economic nationalism, with many posters citing the need to buy war bonds in order to protect the nation's economy. And here, posters would declare the country's own place on the global stage and in the war. They used Canada's political and economic interests as leverage to mobilize the people, and while Canada had entered the war initially for the crown, it had to finish the war and win it in order to guarantee its own economic and political future. Posters therefore helped to establish a new Canadian identity, no longer dependent on the British Empire for support and decision-making. This created the foundations of the Great War's myth that we still have today, with post-war commemoration insisting on the Confederation's rebirth during the war, that unified both French and English Canadians behind a shared goal. And while this discourse served to pacify social tensions, posters in Ireland would instead start to showcase republicanism, leading to radicalization of the calls for independence between 1916 and 1918. As in Canada, Ireland dealt with important crises during the second half of the war, the first of which was the Easter Rising. Beginning on Easter Monday, on April 24th, 1916, the Rising was a pivotal moment when a group of nationalist Republicans staged an armed rebellion against British rule in Dublin. The fighting lasted for about a week and was quickly suppressed by British forces. The leaders of the Rising were executed, which led to eventual widespread support for their cause, and the event proved to be a turning point in increasing and radicalizing nationalist sentiment. Another event that bolstered republicanism in Ireland was the conscription crisis. Announced in 1918, conscription caused widespread outrage in Ireland, leading to a refusal to further participate in what came to be seen as England's war. While conscription was only announced and never actually happened, its effects were still monumental. And furthermore, the indefinite suspension of Home Rule also furthered public disillusion regarding Ireland's place within the UK and led to distrust of all potential cooperation with the Crown. These three factors defined the production of counter-propaganda by Republican groups, especially in 1916 and 1918. Eventually, counter-propaganda overtook the production of official pro-war propaganda, leading to an important battle for public opinion. One of the Republicans' main goals was to maximize the Rising's visibility. In the wake of the executions, Republican groups tried to commemorate the leaders' sacrifice. The middle poster here includes portraits of the leaders of the Rising surrounding a copy of the Proclamation of the Irish Republic. This is to insert the leaders into public memory, showing them as founders of a new independent country. The poster establishes a canonical narrative, creating a pantheon of contemporary heroes to be commemorated and put down into history. By including their execution sentences, the poster transforms these leaders into martyrs, glorifying their suffering for the Republic. And on the right, the poster symbolizes Ireland being reborn out of the leader's sacrifice. Dissenting Republican groups tried to commemorate the birth of the Irish Republic in 1916, and they called upon the authority of a republic fighting against a tyrant. So here, Aaron waves the Irish flag above the Republican fighters, which does look a little bit, for those of you that know French art history, to this painting, La Liberté guidant le peuple by Eugène Delacroix, where Marianne actually resembles a lot Aaron that we see on the right. So here we see an allegory of Ireland that's fighting against British rule, incorporating revolutionary imagery borrowed from past revolutions. The Irish Republic here is born out of armed struggle against imperial forces, symbolizing a newfound Republican identity that was arising out of the ashes of the Rising. And while propaganda from the first half of the war depicted fighting for Ireland, counter-propaganda refused participating in what they considered to be England's war. Republican posters also criticized John Redmond, considering him complicit in the deaths of Irishmen abroad since he was involved in the recruitment efforts. The slogan, "We all kill our own," on the right, condemns Redmond for his role in recruiting and sending young men to their deaths on the battlefield. And on the left, the poster uses an official recruitment poster to label Redmond as the Grim Reaper of the Irish people. The poster criticizes Redmond's hypocrisy in claiming to secure Ireland's political future while aligning himself with the British enemy by sending Irishmen to their deaths. And conscription came to be viewed as the Irish parliamentary party's, so Redmond's party's, fault. This confirmed the shortcomings of moderate nationalist proposals for home rule and in turn solidified Sinn Féin's calls for independence, which led to the party's victory in the 1918 general elections and the subsequent Irish War of Independence, which lasted until 1921. As shown by these posters, republicanism came to be seen as the only viable option for Ireland's future. At the intersection of nationalism and war mobilization, posters visually represent the evolving political trajectories of French Canada and Ireland. They show how wartime messages were tailored to resonate with specific community values and beliefs. The Great War acted as a catalyst to both attachment and resistance against the British Empire, providing insights into the broader phenomenon of imperial decline and the formation of national identities. In essence, the posters from this period reflect significant transformations in French Canadian and Irish nationalism by showcasing their initial convergence and then divergence of their trajectories. While both communities' posters insisted on cultural otherness to justify going into the war in 1914, posters from 1916 onwards insisted on the rebirth of the Canadian Confederation and the Irish Republic. They highlighted their calls for increased autonomy within the empire, although in Ireland this eventually led to independence and civil war. And while Canada reappropriated and nationalized its war effort, Ireland completely refused participating in the war in Europe, as another war was going to be taking place on Irish soil. And while both communities saw the emergence of national identities that moved away from the empire's control, the Canadian Dominion emerged as a nation more autonomous and claimed attributes of military control, trying to defend its own interests in the war, which hinted at Canada signing the Treaty of Versailles in its own name. In Ireland, however, they refused all connection to Britain and the war, Britain's war, because fighting for Ireland eventually turned into fighting in Ireland. And war posters reflect these changes. While initially produced to lead popular mobilization for the Empire's war effort, posters in Canada eventually needed to be used as tools for social cohesion. Whereas in Ireland, they became a tool of political persuasion used by Republican groups to convince the population of their political project's legitimacy. French-Canadian posters also show the disappearance of French-Canadian identity that was overshadowed by the binational Canadian identity that emerged during the war, where the both founding nations came together through the war, and this is still a very important part of the war myth, as we remember the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which is considered one of the first battles where all Canadian regiments were fighting together for the first time. In Ireland, the moderate nationalist identity, which was built on the Home Rule project, eventually was replaced by a more radical Republican nationalism that was ready to use violence in order to achieve independence, asserting Ireland's political difference within the empire. Posters therefore show how the image of national community was altered by the war, while showcasing the emergence of new forms of nationalism that were driven by the Great War's experience. So thank you for allowing me to present my research today. And for those of you that are interested in more and that can speak French, you can purchase my book online. It's available in a couple bookstores. And if any of you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much.